He's gonna tear his brace!
Let me go!
Get him down now!
You can't keep me here!
The first thing the nurses heard was the sound of a metal tray crashing against the hospital floor. Then came the shouting, the frantic footsteps, and the terrified voice of a medic begging everyone to stay back. In the middle of the military medical center stood a badly injured Navy SEAL, his uniform torn, one leg heavily bandaged, blood staining the sheets beneath him. 4 men were struggling to keep him from getting out of the bed, but every time someone reached for him, he fought like a cornered animal. He was stronger than his injuries seemed to allow, and there was something terrifying in his eyes, not anger, but fear. He would not let anyone touch him. Doctors had tried sedatives. Medics had tried restraint. His teammates had tried calling his name. Nothing worked. Then a new nurse stepped through the doorway, looked at the wounded man for only a few seconds, and quietly said the one thing nobody in that hospital had heard in 15 years. She said his old call sign. The SEAL froze. And for the first time since he had arrived, the room became completely silent. If you believe kindness can reach people when medicine cannot, and if you believe everyone deserves a second chance, take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel. Sometimes the smallest act of compassion can reach a place that years of treatment never could. It was a stormy Tuesday evening at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland, when Chief Petty Officer Nathaniel Brooks was brought through the emergency entrance. Nathaniel had spent most of his adult life in places where people learned to survive before they learned to trust. At 39, he was a decorated Navy SEAL who had served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and several classified operations he was never allowed to discuss outside secure rooms. His body carried the evidence of those years. There were scars across his shoulder, a jagged mark along his ribs, and an old injury in his left knee that had never fully healed. But his most recent injuries were different. They were the kind that made even experienced military doctors exchange worried looks. Nathaniel had been injured during a training operation in Virginia when a vehicle carrying his team rolled during a high-speed maneuver. The accident had crushed part of his left leg, fractured his collarbone, and caused a severe concussion. 2 of his teammates had walked away with minor injuries, but Nathaniel had been trapped inside the vehicle for nearly 20 minutes before rescue crews reached him. By the time they pulled him free, he was barely conscious. He had lost a dangerous amount of blood, and his nervous system was overwhelmed by pain, shock, and confusion. When he woke at Walter Reed, he didn't know where he was. He only knew that strangers were touching him. The moment a nurse reached for his fore, Nathaniel jerked violently and nearly tore it from his arm. When a doctor attempted to examine his leg, he shoved the man's hand away. When 2 corpsmen tried to reposition him, Nathaniel struck one of them across the chest with enough force to send him stumbling backward. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone. Somewhere inside his damaged mind, he was still trapped in the wreckage, surrounded by smoke, twisted metal, and hands pulling at him while he fought to stay conscious. The medical staff tried everything. They lowered the lights. They spoke slowly. They explained every procedure before attempting it. They called in his commanding officer. His teammates came to his bedside, hoping familiar faces would calm him. Instead, Nathaniel became more agitated whenever anyone approached. The hospital's trauma psychologist, Dr. Caleb Mercer, believed Nathaniel was experiencing an extreme trauma response complicated by his concussion. The problem was that Nathaniel couldn't tell anyone what he was seeing or feeling. He had spent years training himself to control fear, pain, and instinct. Now his brain had taken those instincts and turned them against the people trying to save him. For 2 nights, nobody slept properly on the ward. Nathaniel repeatedly tried to climb out of bed despite his shattered leg. He ripped off monitoring equipment. He refused medication. When anyone touched his shoulder, he reacted instantly. His teammates began to fear that he would seriously injure himself before the doctors could stabilize him. Then, on the 3rd morning, a new nurse named Grace Whitaker arrived for her first shift. Grace was 31 years old and had transferred to Walter Reed after several years working in emergency nursing at a civilian trauma center in North Carolina. She wasn't the most senior nurse on the floor, and she certainly wasn't the loudest. What made Grace different was that she had a habit of watching before acting. She noticed how patients breathed, where they looked, how their hands moved, and what sounds made them tense. When Grace entered Nathaniel's room, she didn't walk toward him. She stood near the doorway. The room was tense. Nathaniel sat against the raised bed, his jaw clenched, his injured leg immobilized. 3 members of his SEAL team were nearby, along with a physician and 2 corpsmen. His eyes moved from person to person as if calculating who would reach him first. Grace looked at him, then at the medical chart. She noticed his name. Nathaniel Brooks. But then she noticed something else. Attached to his old military records was a brief note about a classified deployment years earlier. Most of the information had been redacted, but one small reference remained from an old psychological evaluation. It mentioned that Nathaniel had once served under a team designation connected to a call sign. Grace had seen that call sign before. Not in a military file. In an old photograph. Her father had served as a Navy corpsman before retiring, and years earlier, Grace had found a photograph among his belongings. It showed a group of young operators standing beside a helicopter. Her father had written several names on the back. One name had been crossed out, replaced by a nickname. Ghost. Grace looked back at Nathaniel. The man in the photograph had been younger, leaner, smiling in a way that seemed almost impossible to connect with the frightened, wounded man in front of her. She took one slow breath. Then she said, "Ghost." Nathaniel stopped moving. Everyone in the room stared at Grace. His breathing changed first. His shoulders lowered by barely an inch. His eyes fixed on her face. Grace didn't move closer. She said the call sign again, quietly, not as an order, but as recognition. Ghost. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then Nathaniel whispered something nobody could understand. Grace waited. His eyes filled with tears. One of his teammates lowered his head because he understood immediately. The call sign hadn't been used in years. It belonged to another Nathaniel, a younger man before the missions, before the funerals, before the scars, before the weight of memories he carried alone. Grace slowly pulled a chair across the room and sat down. She didn't touch him. She didn't ask him to calm down. She didn't tell him he was safe. Instead, she simply stayed. For nearly 20 minutes, Grace sat there while Nathaniel watched her. The room gradually became quieter. She instructed everyone else to give him space. When another nurse entered, Grace raised one hand and asked her to wait. Eventually, Nathaniel's breathing slowed. That was the first breakthrough. Over the next several hours, Grace discovered that Nathaniel responded better to choices than commands. Instead of telling him what would happen, she explained what she needed to do and allowed him time to prepare. If she needed to check his IV, she told him first. If she needed to adjust his blanket, she waited for him to nod. If he said no, she stepped back. It seemed simple. But to Nathaniel, it was everything. He had spent years being ordered into danger. His body had been trained to react before thinking. After the accident, every touch had become a threat because his mind couldn't separate the hospital from the wreckage. Grace gave him something his damaged brain desperately needed. Control. Days passed. Nathaniel slowly began accepting treatment. He allowed the doctors to change his dressings. He accepted pain medication. He even permitted physical therapists to begin moving his uninjured leg. But he still refused to talk about the accident. Grace never forced him. Instead, she learned about the man underneath the uniform. Nathaniel loved black coffee, hated hospitals, collected old vinyl records, and had a younger sister named Rebecca who lived in Colorado. He had a golden retriever named Scout who was staying with a friend while he recovered. He had once planned to leave the military within 2 years and open a small outdoor training business for veterans. The future he had imagined suddenly seemed impossibly far away. His left leg might never function the same way. His shoulder required surgery. His concussion symptoms continued. And every night, the nightmares returned. One night, Grace found him awake at 2:17 a.m. He was staring at the ceiling, breathing hard. Sweat covered his forehead. He had tears in his eyes, but he refused to wipe them away. Grace stood beside the door. She didn't touch him. She simply said, "Ghost." Nathaniel closed his eyes. This time, he didn't fight. He began crying. Not the kind of crying people do when they want comfort, but the silent, exhausted tears of someone who has held everything inside for too long. Grace pulled the chair closer but still waited for permission before sitting beside him. After several minutes, Nathaniel finally told her what he had seen during the accident. He had believed one of his teammates was trapped beneath the vehicle. He had heard someone calling for help. He had tried to reach him. But the sound had actually been coming from a damaged radio. Nathaniel had spent 3 days believing he had failed someone who wasn't there. Grace listened. She didn't tell him to forget it. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault. She simply reminded him that sometimes trauma creates memories that feel more real than reality itself. That conversation became the beginning of his recovery. Weeks later, Nathaniel underwent another surgery. This time, he entered the operating room willingly. Before they rolled him away, he looked toward Grace. She understood what he needed without him saying it. She reminded him of the old call sign. Ghost. Nathaniel smiled for the first time since the accident. It was small. Almost invisible. But it was real. His recovery was painfully slow. There were days when he hated his body. Days when he threw his therapy equipment across the room. Days when he told his doctors he would never walk normally again. There were mornings when he stared at the wheelchair beside his bed and wondered whether the man he had been was gone forever. Grace never promised that everything would be okay. Instead, she reminded him that healing didn't mean becoming the person he was before. It meant discovering who he could become next. Months passed. Nathaniel learned to stand. Then he learned to take one step. Then two. The first time he walked 6 feet with assistance, his sister Rebecca cried. His teammates turned away so he wouldn't see their faces. Grace stood near the wall, smiling quietly. Nathaniel reached the end of the parallel bars and stopped. He looked down at his injured leg. Then he looked at Grace. For a moment, neither said anything. Finally, he whispered that there had been a time when he thought the strongest thing a person could do was survive. Grace told him that survival was only the beginning. That sentence stayed with him. A year after the accident, Nathaniel returned to Walter Reed, not in a hospital bed, not in a wheelchair, but walking with a cane. He came carrying a small wooden box. Inside was an old military photograph. The same photograph Grace had once seen among her father's belongings. Nathaniel had discovered the connection after learning that Grace's father had served with a medical unit that supported his old team. The photograph had survived all those years. Nathaniel handed it to Grace. On the back was the old call sign. Ghost. He told her that he had spent most of his life believing the name represented the person he had lost. But now he understood something different. Ghost wasn't the man who disappeared in the darkness. Ghost was the man who found his way back. Grace looked at the photograph and then at Nathaniel. Neither of them needed to say anything else. Sometimes people don't need someone to fix them. Sometimes they need someone willing to sit beside them while they remember how to find themselves again. Nathaniel eventually retired from active service. He didn't open the business he had once imagined exactly as planned. Instead, he created a small nonprofit that helped wounded veterans transition into civilian life. He focused especially on veterans who struggled silently with trauma and refused help because they believed asking for it made them weak. Every year, he returned to Walter Reed. And every year, he visited the same hallway. He would stop outside the room where everything had changed and remember the frightened man who had once believed every hand reaching toward him was a threat. Grace continued working as a nurse. She never considered herself a hero. When people asked her what she had done to help Nathaniel, she always gave the same simple answer. She had listened. She had waited. And she had remembered the man before the injury. That was all. But sometimes, all is enough. Because Nathaniel didn't need another person to overpower him. He needed someone who could see past the uniform, past the scars, past the anger, past the fear, and recognize that somewhere beneath all of it was still a young man who had once answered to an old call sign. Ghost. And when the world treated him like a broken soldier, Grace treated him like a human being. That was the difference. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who believes wounded people deserve patience, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach people who may need a little hope today. Before the ending, leave a comment saying, kindness can bring people back, if you believe that sometimes the most powerful medicine isn't found in a bottle, a machine, or an operating room, but in the simple decision to stay when someone else is struggling. Because Nathaniel's greatest victory wasn't walking again. It wasn't returning to the hospital. It wasn't surviving the accident. His greatest victory was learning that being strong didn't mean fighting every hand that reached for him. Sometimes strength means letting someone help. Sometimes courage means admitting you're afraid. And sometimes healing begins with one person looking at you, not as a wounded body, not as a broken soldier, not as a problem to solve, but as the person you were before the pain. Years later, Nathaniel kept that photograph beside his front door. Whenever he left his house, he saw it. Whenever he came home, he saw it again. And beneath the photograph, he had written a single sentence. I wasn't saved because someone was strong enough to hold me down. I was saved because someone was gentle enough to let me feel safe. And that was how the old ghost finally came home.